Today, a special Free Speech TV Just Solutions in the wake of the guilty verdict of Derek Chauvin. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar, and my guest is Jody Armour, a professor of law at the University of Southern California, where he specializes in race issues and legal decision-making. We'll discuss the significance of the verdict and what comes next. That's Free Speech TV, Just Solutions. And welcome everyone to the program. Jody Armour is the Roy P. Crocker Professor of Law at the University of Southern California. He's the author of Negrophobia and Reasonable Racism, The Hidden Cost of Being Black in America. He's also Soros Justice Senior Fellow of the Open Society Institute's Center on Crime, Communities, and Culture. And his newest book has an explosive title. It deals with race, language, unequal justice, and the law. It's always a pleasure to speak with you, Jody. Welcome to the program.
Always good talking with you, Sonali.
So barely did we have a chance to celebrate the guilty verdict in the Derek Chauvin case in Minneapolis over the killing of George Floyd when we heard of the fatal police shooting of 15, or I think she was 16-year-old Makia Bryant in Columbus, Ohio. And of course, days earlier, we have the Brooklyn Center police killing of Dante Wright. Some are saying that the Chauvin verdict is a huge victory. It's a step in the right direction. Others say it's not even justice at all. What do you say?
The celebrations were premature. The celebrations I saw coming out of the Attorney General's office with Ellison and the prosecutors was embarrassing. This wasn't a moment for an eruption of joy, right? This was a moment for a kind of somber and stunned satisfaction, because that's what I felt. You know, I didn't feel an eruption of joy. I felt relieved that I didn't see happen in this case what I've seen happen in other cases with compelling video evidence of police brutality against Black people. Rodney King, right, in 91 here in LA where I am now, the videotape saturated the airwaves of those 4 officers beating him to a pulp. And we saw that go to the trial in Simi Valley. The jury looked at that video that we all saw, ocular proof of brutality and outrageous conduct, and they acquitted all 4 officers. They said, we as representatives of the community, we as representatives of America, right? That's what the jury is, a representative sample. They said, we as representatives don't see anything wrong here in this video. So they gaslighted Black America in that first Simi Valley jury verdict in the Rodney King case involving a videotape beating. Then later, that's not just a relic of a historical bygone era. We see Walter Scott running away from police on video, shot 6 times in the back. We saw that on video. And then the jury deadlocked with that video, right? And so when it came to this case, I was worrying, as many others were, how low can the bar go? How about 9 minutes and 29 seconds? Can leaning on his neck 3 minutes after he's dead, will that be enough? Will a video of that be enough to get through to the jury? And it was, okay, it was. That's the kind of the relief I feel, the somber relief. But to celebrate saying that's the bar, now the bar is that low, that we just sent a strong signal out to police all over America that you may be able to get away with shooting a Black man in the back 6 times, as happened in Walter Scott's case, or beating a man to a pulp, as happened in the Rodney King case. But, don't lean on his neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds brazenly with a camera on you, with a lot of people around you, and 3 minutes after he's dead. That may be a bridge too far. We're celebrating that.
Jody, we also realize that there was a 1-year period of mass protests that went before this Derek Chauvin trial. And millions of people, not just in America, but around the world, protested. And that tremendous amount of relentless activism, of course, made a huge difference in this case. All of that work to get one conviction in one case in a situation where, as you point out, the bar was so so low. So what should the next steps be? If Derek Chauvin is guilty, how can activists build on this to say, then we need to retry all of these other cases? I know that in the case of Tamir Rice, the 13-year-old African-American child who was shot by police, his mother wants to reopen his case.
Yeah, it's going to be hard to reopen those cases. That's the problem with so many of these cases, right? We have to swallow the indignity, swallow the injustice. Most times you can't get anything done about it, really. And these kinds of cases, I'm glad you brought home that point, going in here, that this trial is the result, and this conviction is really as much the result, more the result, not of the exertions of the attorney general or the prosecutors in the case, but first of Darnella Frazier, that brave Black 17-year-old, I'll call a young lady girl, who stood there in the face of police telling her not to record them and intrepidly recorded them, right? And then, if you look at the police report immediately after the incident, they had lied on the police report. Nothing was getting ready to happen. It was going to happen anyway until the people took to the streets. And the riots erupted. Remember that? Let's not forget, riots erupted to get Derek Chauvin indicted. So when people say, just vote, don't protest, riots don't accomplish anything, I beg to differ. And I think this is more proof that, the grassroots activism, getting out in the street, getting in the face of authorities can move the needle, not only in a case like this, but in places like, here I am, LA. We brought in a progressive DA, thanks to voters, and Measure J, defund the police measure. So yeah, don't wag your finger patronizingly at activists and protesters and tell them, just go vote. This wasn't about just going and voting. This was about grassroots activism and confrontation, disruption, right?
You're using the word that Maxine Waters used when she visited Minneapolis. She's, of course, our congressman here in Southern California, and Republicans fixated on her. In fact, the judge in the case even said maybe Chauvin's lawyers could appeal because of her words. How incredible is it that instead of focusing on the violence that Chauvin wreaked that killed a man, they're focusing on Maxine Waters' demand to activists to be confrontational?
Yeah, Sonali, this is one area that I think we, at least I, as a dissident and dissenter on the left, have to be, careful about right? Yes, they're trying to have her not speak out frankly and freely about, conditions and how, if this miscarriage of justice happens, we should, stay in the streets. That's what protest is about. Why is that so objectionable? But they're calling it incitement. And remember when they were calling what Trump was saying incitement, right? Too easy. It's a little too easy to call something incitement. We should be careful, even when it comes to people we don't really like. We really don't like Trump. But to give them the tool of saying that's incitement in his case also gives them the tool of incitement to go after people like Maxine Waters, Patrisse Cullors, Melina Abdullah, Black Lives Matter activists, etc. So I'm generally, let's go hard, when it comes to racial and social justice with our protests. I worry when it comes to speech codes and anything that comes out of people. I used to run around saying, fight the powers that be. I could see somebody saying, fight the powers that be. Armour's trying to foment, armed rebellion, so I just worry about that. But you're right. Yeah, she was right. If this had, we dodged the meteor. If there had been an acquittal in this case, Sonali, all right, the bar at that point, we saw what happened in LA in '92 when the criminal justice system loses its moral credibility and legitimacy, all hell can break loose. There would have been urban conflagrations across the nation.
Right. So let's talk about the legal next steps. Attorney General Merrick Garland has announced a review of policing in America. It sounds a little bit like what Eric Holder had started under President Obama, then Attorney General, which may have been prematurely stopped by the Trump administration. But these sound like modest reforms. Some are calling for an end to qualified immunity. And yet others, including those in the Black Lives Matter movement, are saying we need to continue defunding police. Very few police departments have actually carved out of police budgets some money and put into social services. So where does that fight need to start? It sounds as though there are a number of tools at our disposal, and pursuing any and all of them is important, right?
Well, yeah, but we need to know what our priorities are. We need to be real clear, right? The George Floyd Act would not have prevented what happened to George Floyd. None of those provisions, all right?
This is the reform bill in the House that Democrats have put out.
Exactly. It wouldn't have prevented what happened to Dante Wright, all right? The problem with the police isn't their implicit bias training, that they need more of it, or that they need more body cams, right? The problem with the police is you have people whose role in society, occupational role, is to be violence workers. That's what they are. We give them a Glock with live ammunition, a stun gun, mace, a billy club, handcuffs. They are violence workers, all right? And they're also people, ordinary human beings with all the unconscious biases that everyone else has, right? And if you put these violence workers into contact with members of stereotyped groups, they're going to act against members of those stereotype groups on the basis of their stereotypes. They're going to stereotype them, and they're going to brutalize them, as we're seeing over and over again. The only way to prevent not more harm to the stereotype group from these violence workers is to minimize the contact. We can't train it out of the violence work. You can't train violence workers to not succumb to their unconscious mental reflexes. I used to talk that way. I used to talk that way. The research has come down lately, says, yes, our unconscious biases are there, but there's very little we can do to control them. So forget trying to train police out of unconscious bias, minimize the context. For example, they should not be engaging in traffic stops. Dante Wright should not have been pulled over for an air freshener hanging from his rearview mirror or expired tag. There's no reason for police to be involved in all of the profile stopping they're doing, the stop and frisk on wheels that they're doing, because the Supreme Court gave them law and said you can make pretext stops. If you see a young black guy in a car and you have a hunch that he's doing criminal wrong, but it's only a hunch because he's just a young black guy, that's not enough for reasonable suspicion under the Fourth Amendment, right? But the Supreme Court said if you find a pretext, like air freshener hanging from his rearview mirror, then you can pull him over and act on that hunch. It's an end run, a big loophole in the Fourth Amendment that we've created for the police, and it allows stop and frisk on wheels. We need to get them out of traffic enforcement, get them out of healthcare, out of homelessness, going after houseless folks, get them out of drug, the whole war on drugs. We're still, Breonna Taylor's dead today because of the war on drugs, not just because of the no-knock raid, but because the no-knock raid was part of a continuing war on drugs that's failed. Those are the interventions we need to make to prevent this from happening again. Just holding Derek Chauvin accountable isn't going to result in justice in this case.
Jody, have we moved the needle when it comes to the war on drugs? Because, of course, in the Derek Chauvin trial, the issue of drug use and addiction came up. And, of course, in the past, immediately victims of police brutality have been criminalized before, essentially their assassination justified after the fact. Simply if they happened to have been using narcotics. But we saw an interesting thing play out in the Derek Chauvin trial. His white ex-girlfriend talked about their shared struggle with opiates addiction. And even the defense attorney had to express his sympathy with her. And then, of course, they still tried to go after after George Floyd, suggesting that because he had narcotics in his bloodstream, that was the real cause of his death. But have we moved the needle, especially considering that marijuana use has been legalized in so many states? Are you hopeful that we're overturning, or at least turning the end chapter on the war on drugs and closing that chapter?
Perhaps we're certainly seeing a lot of progress being made, for sure. But remember, Philando Castile, also in Minnesota, one of the most gut-wrenching cases you can possibly see, with the officer shooting him, his girlfriend and her little daughter in the back seat. puts it on Facebook Live, and we see him bleed out. The officer said what justified him walking up on Philando Castile with a drawn gun was he smelled the aroma of marijuana coming wafting from the window, right? That's a common excuse still used by police in every jurisdiction that it's illegal or still criminalized, or even where it's, medical marijuana is permitted, they'll still use that excuse. But yes, you are absolutely right. State after state has legalized cannabis. And I'm hesitant to call it marijuana. I'm trying to work on that because I understand that's a racist label. Cannabis is my preference now. State after state is rolling on this, recognizing that what my dad was sentenced to 22 to 55 years. I lost my dad to prison, and they sentenced him to 22 to 55 years for possession and sale of marijuana. Think about how far we've come from that moment when I lost my dad, family separation, my 7 siblings and I, to where we are now, where there are boutique little cannabis shops, right, up and down the west side of LA, right? So when are we going to realize that? And this is the other part of how we minimize other cases like Derek Chauvin and George Floyd. When are we going to learn a lot? When are we going to learn that anytime we criminalize consensual adult activity, we regret it afterwards. We criminalized same-sex intimacy. I taught my law students up until 2003, we were locking people up. Same-sex couples who exchanged intimacy were felons in a number of jurisdictions, right? It's insane how many things that it's wrong-headed, I'm sorry. It's wrong-headed how many things we criminalize that we shouldn't, and marijuana, this is a clear example. And by the way, I'll just say this real quickly, Sonali. Remember when as these states, more and more states legalize marijuana, we reap the tax benefits. Crime hasn't gone up any appreciably connected to marijuana. Remember all the law enforcement interests who were prognosticating gloom and doom, who were giving us all these kind of cataclysmic apocalyptic predictions of what would happen if we legalized marijuana. Look how wrong they were. Why do we keep giving law enforcement credibility on crime and punishment issues?
And so then let's follow up that with, why do we keep giving law enforcement money, so much of it? City budgets are still incredibly focused on police. If you look at a pie chart of any standard city budget, the police often have the largest share, a plurality of the dollars. And some of the efforts at defunding police have just meant that they might not have gotten half of the raise that was scheduled, to be given to them in the new year. So how far has the movement to defund the police gotten? I know in Los Angeles, where we have an incredibly active Black Lives Matter chapter, there's been a huge push on that area. And some other cities, in Minneapolis, there was an effort. The city council, in fact, said a year ago that they would begin to defund these police stations. Has that gotten anywhere?
Well, as you said, Sonali, where there's been really strong and persistent grassroots activism, we've seen real progress. Like here in LA, Measure J, right, voted in by the electorate, thanks to the activism in the street, takes 10% of the LA County unrestricted budget, and that annually, and that's up to roughly $10 billion a year, can be. It takes 10% of that, $1 billion a year, and dedicates it to alternatives to incarceration. More and more people are starting to realize that we have an addiction to law enforcement. We've been really kind of socialized into that addiction. We've had 30, 40 years of propaganda in the form of Law and Order shows. Think about the Law and Order franchise itself and all the rest of the, procedurals that we've kind of absorbed and kind of given the police a halo. And then we have this idea that somehow they can reduce crime. Where there are a lot of police, Sonali, in many urban areas, the clearance rate for things like murder and rape is under 30 For rape, for example, it's under 20% in a lot of major metropolitan areas. For homicide, it's under 35%, and it's even lower if you take out the people who you are obviously the wrongdoers, right? They're standing over the person with a smoking gun. If you don't have those, that's 1/3 of the cases. You have a really good chance of getting away with murder in this country if you just exercise any care, because the police are that bad at solving serious crimes. They're chasing turnstile jumpers. They're going after people with air fresheners hanging from the rearview mirrors, and letting rape kit backlogs pile up and not addressing them, right? So we need to refocus the police, unbundle the police, get them out of a lot of things that they're doing now that they shouldn't be doing, focus their energies and attentions on things that they should be doing, which is one thing, solving murders and rapes, violent crime. That takes a lot of effort and work, and it's labor intensive, resource intensive. That's the work they should be doing.
So when we think about the money that is also spent on police, often people don't understand that the lawsuits that police face from the many cases of brutality, countless cases that may not even result in death, but may result in serious injury. When those lawsuits are settled, the money comes out of our city budgets. It doesn't come out of the police department budgets. It doesn't come out of their pensions. It comes out of the money that should be spent in our cities on our services. And so I'm wondering if a change to that, where that money comes from, if cities can pass budgets suggesting that settlement money should come out of the police budgets, I'm wondering if it would have a better impact on police, not being so trigger happy, because it actually costs us even more than we think it does.
Yeah, they're insulated from the consequences of their own wrongdoing financially, right? They get to offload the consequences, the financial consequences of their wrongdoing onto others, onto us, on the rest of us, and often onto the very same taxpayers they're brutalizing, right? So yes, and qualified immunity also gives them that kind of insulation from legal consequences, civil damage consequences for their wrongdoing, the whole qualified immunity doctrine. So that would be one way to start to address this, Sonali, to be sure. It's worth recognizing that had George Floyd not died, had Dante Wright not died, if that had happened, right, we wouldn't even be talking about him right now, right? That would be ordinary police conduct, right? Everything up until the moment of their death would be ordinary police conduct. Why is that ordinary police conduct? They said even in the trial of Derek Chauvin that everything they did to George Floyd up until the point they pulled him out of the car and put him on the ground was perfectly in policy and within the law. What? Sonali, you're telling me if I drive up here to West LA, go into a 7-Eleven, buy a bottle of soda, okay, and I'm sitting in my European sedan, and I'm living in West LA, and I'm drinking my Snapple, and the clerk says, "Oh, this looks like a counterfeit $20." You think that I would turn around and see a police officer the next thing I know pointing a gun at my head, saying, "Get out of the car"? I understand there's an allegation that there's a counterfeit $20 bill. Do I have to know it's 20? Is there any mens rea? Do I have to be aware of it? None of that, right? But that was ordinary police activity and practice that we've said is all right. That is the kind of stuff we need to stop. And that's what gives rise to a lot of these lawsuits. Get them out of that business. Focus them on the things these violence workers on the things they should be focused on, and we'll all be a lot better off.
Jody, a lot of folks who've been active in Black Lives Matter, also the prison abolition movement, have said we need to start envisioning a society without police. And that picks up a little bit on what you were saying earlier, where police need to, at the very least, be focused on the things that matter, the hard work of solving violent crime. But how do we get to that place? And is it just purely aspirational, or can we actually work toward a society where police are obsolete? We haven't even talked about guns. Gun violence is so huge, and armed police are part of that problem of gun violence in America, even though they're often not seen as part of that problem, right?
Yeah, Sonali, one of the things I point out in my latest book, in *PGA Theory*, is that really, when you look at the crime rates between middle-class blacks and middle-class whites, they're the same. So there is a disproportionate involvement in crime of Black Americans, street crime. There is a disproportionate involvement, but that's all from truly disadvantaged Blacks. That's what creates the disproportionate numbers that we see. The truly disadvantaged members of the Black community, like you walk down here in LA, Skid Row, the fiercest expression of structural violence in America, highest concentration of homelessness. You see 75% of the faces are Black, right? So if we really want to address crime, since most of the crime is in the Black community, is coming from the ranks of truly disadvantaged Blacks who are trapped in criminogenic conditions, then we have to reimagine safety. We have to say, we're not going to throw police into those criminogenic conditions to arrest people who are engaging in behavior that is foreseeable they're going to engage in if they are desperate and trapped in desperate circumstances. Instead, we're going to lift them out of those desperate circumstances. We're going to spend on housing. We're going to spend on jobs. We're going to do something about these crumbling schools. We're going to do something about health care so everybody has it. Why are we still talking about Medicare for all? It's mind-boggling. We're going to make those our priorities. We're going to reimagine safety, because if you pull people out of criminogenic conditions, then they don't commit crimes. They commit crimes at a much lower rate. So you actually promote, police are not solving the crime. We just talked about that. Only 30, 40% of homicides, less than 20% of rapes. They're not solving crime. So what makes us safer is preventing crime. And crime prevention comes in pulling people out of criminogenic conditions by spending on, social safety and social welfare.
So that's where this idea of defunding the police meets programs like the Green New Deal or Medicare for All, where we are pouring our money, taxpayer dollars, into programs that actually benefit us instead of into policing or corporate subsidies or oil and gas company subsidies, et cetera, or tax breaks for corporations and the wealthy, or wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Even though the war in Afghanistan is supposedly ending, we're going to continue an air war, which no one's talking about. So we're spending all of this money, our money, on all of these things that don't make us any safer. And all of this ties into a conversation around how Derek Chauvin killed George Floyd and how so many countless police have killed so many people of color and gone, unaccounted for and not faced justice. So it's so important, I think, for us to have these systemic and holistic discussions that are often left out of the mainstream media. And this is where, of course, independent journalism is important as well. Because, Jody, I think you might be disappointed, as I have as well, where our corporate media really did a terrible job on explaining what the slogan, say, defunded the police, meant, right? They have reductive analyses.
Oh, yeah, they have knee-jerk reactions. And I have friends in law enforcement who also have knee-jerk reactions to defund the police. It's a triggering term for them, right? But you know what else was a triggering term? And they lecture, Black activists and Black Lives Matter activists and their allies not to use defund the police because it's triggering. We're going to police your political communication and tell you what language you should and shouldn't use. I mean, the effrontery, Sonali, they're preaching to a group of people who have brought about a generational upheaval, the biggest social movement of my lifetime for sure. And they've been resoundingly successful because they have stuck to their guns. For example, Black Lives Matter. I remember when that phrase first came up, people criticized it. Oh, don't say Black Lives Matter, all lives matter. Oh, right. Don't say Black Lives Matter, it's divisive. And then about a year and a half later, they turned around and said, oh, Blue Lives Matter, which meant they got it all along. They were just being, a-holes about it, because they knew it was always an ellipsis. Black Lives Matter also, Black Lives Matter too. The ellipsis was implied and understood, but they wanted to play dumb. So right. Same thing with defund the police. Again, I can explain defund the police to you just as quickly as I can explain Black Lives Matter. Yes, it's a little provocative, but that's the point. It gives us a chance to unify and rally around something that is saying we're going after foundational, structural stuff. We're not going after reform. So it's effective in that way. And then you can explain it in just the way you did and I did. We need to reimagine safety by pulling people out of criminogenic conditions.
Thank you so much, Jody Armour. We're out of time. He's the Roy P. Crocker Professor of Law at the University of Southern California. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar, and this is Just Solutions.